Hey there, my friends. Thank you for being here tonight. Stay close, because what you're about to hear isn't just another piece of news. It's a story the world tried to erase. 6 minutes of footage, gone without a trace. Not blocked, not hidden. Deleted. 1,000 people saw it before it vanished from every platform, like smoke pulled back into the sky. Officials called it an error. But you don't erase an error. You erase evidence. The video showed something the powerful weren't ready for. A forest lit up like dawn, a roar cutting through the night, and then silence. Later, they gave it a name whispered across the desert. Operation Sandstorm. What happened in those minutes would change how the world looked at Africa, at power, and at who gets to write history. Now, before we go further, take a moment to breathe, because truth, real truth, isn't trending anymore. It's hunted, buried, forgotten. And yet sometimes it refuses to die. Tonight I'm asking you not just to watch, but to remember. Because if they can delete a victory once, they can do it again. Somewhere deep in Burkina Faso, in a place called Jerry Forest, a silence was broken. Not by foreign drones, not by outsiders, but by men who carried their nation's hope on their backs. Soldiers with patched uniforms, tired eyes, and hearts steady as drums. No one paid them. No one praised them. But they moved. They acted. And when the dust settled, the question wasn't just what happened. It was why the world tried so hard to pretend it didn't. So stay with me, my friends, because if 6 minutes of truth could vanish from the internet, imagine what other stories never made it to your screens. This one did, and tonight we'll tell it together. The story begins on a moonless night, deep inside the eastern plains of Burkina Faso. A place few could find on a map, yet a place where history would quietly bend. Locals called it Jerry Forest, a green scar on red earth, a stretch of land swallowed by fear for nearly 2 decades. It looked peaceful from the sky, but those who lived near its edge knew better. Trucks went in and never came out. Farmers disappeared. Children learned to stop asking where their fathers went. For years, the forest wasn't a home. It was a wound. Then came a night when the air itself felt different. Cooler. Still. Men gathered at the edge of that forest, silent. Their faces marked not by rank but by resolve. They weren't mercenaries or foreign contractors. They were Burkina soldiers, sons of the same soil that had buried their brothers. The order was simple: encircle, strike, recover. But simplicity dies first in war. They moved without chatter, guided by memory more than maps. Each man carried an old rifle, patched boots, and something no weapon could replace: faith. Their commander, a man whose name the world may never know, whispered a single line before they entered. Tonight, we fight to bring silence back to the living. Hours passed. The forest swallowed them whole. Then, sometime before dawn, a sound split the darkness. A single thunder that rolled through the trees like the sky itself had cracked. Explosions followed. The earth shook, and from miles away, villagers said it felt like the ground was finally breathing again after years of holding its breath. By sunrise, Jerry Forest was unrecognizable. Smoke curled like thin fingers through the trees, curling around the broken steel of enemy camps. 41 militants were gone. 40 rifles seized. 91 magazines, an RPG, and a PKM machine gun. Numbers that sound cold on paper, but each one marked the end of a nightmare. When the soldiers emerged, they didn't cheer. They didn't pose for cameras. They carried more than weapons. They carried proof. In their packs were cell phones filled with foreign numbers, cash printed in unfamiliar languages, and GPS units traced to countries far beyond Africa. For years, many in the West called the Sahel's war an internal problem. That morning, the evidence said otherwise. And yet, what mattered most wasn't what they found, but what they felt. For the first time, villagers didn't hide. They came out carrying bread and water, calling the soldiers brothers. A boy, no older than 10, pointed at one of them and whispered a single word. Burkinab. Not a soldier, not a stranger. A protector. One commander recorded that moment on his phone. Children laughing, women weeping, soldiers sharing food with the people they had saved. Hours later, that footage was gone from every platform, wiped like it had never existed. But for those who stood there, the memory stayed. Because no algorithm can delete what a soul remembers. When the convoy returned to Ouagadougou, there were no parades, just quiet nods, tired faces, and an understanding that something had changed. For decades, the Sahel had been defined by dependence, waiting for help, waiting for air support, waiting for permission. That night, the waiting ended. Western analysts later called it unexpected coordination, as if unity among Africans was an accident. But on the ground, everyone knew better. Jerry Forrest wasn't a coincidence. It was conviction. And as dusk fell again over the plains, a commander looked out across the smoke and said softly, "If this was only the rehearsal, imagine the next act." No one answered him. They didn't need to, because somewhere beyond that horizon, the storm was already moving. But what came next would shake more than a forest. It would test whether the idea born that night, the idea that Africa could defend itself, could truly survive the pressure of the world beyond its borders. When the dust of Jerry Forrest settled, the silence did not mean peace. It meant preparation. Because while the world was still debating whether the footage was real, something new was already moving across the border into Mali. They called it Sikasso, a name that would soon echo through every command radio from the dunes of Timbuktu to the savannas of Niger. Under a burning sun, a convoy rolled across the desert. Fuel tankers, ration trucks, and armored escorts stretching like a living vein across the Sahel. Every wheel that turned was defiance in motion. For years, these same roads were symbols of fear. Roads that belonged to no one, where ambushes were not a question of if, but when. But this time the rhythm was different. The soldiers didn't move like men waiting to die. They moved like men who had already decided not to. From the ridges, eyes watched, hidden, patient. Triggers were tightened, radios clicked, and the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Then it came. The ambush. Gunfire erupted like the sky shattering, the first explosion turning a fuel truck into a pillar of flame. For a moment, chaos threatened to return. But instead of panic, something colder took over. Discipline. In one synchronized motion, Burkina and Malian soldiers disembarked, their formation precise, almost rehearsed. No shouting, no confusion. Just command. They advanced. Not backward, not hiding behind smoke, but forward, through it. Bullets hissed past, sand jumped, engines burned, but their pace never broke. Every man moved as if pulled by a single heartbeat. The fight didn't last long. Within minutes, the roar turned to silence again. But this time it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of mastery. When the dust cleared, the convoy was still standing. Not a single truck left behind. Not one soldier abandoned. Hours later, as they entered Sikasso, the villagers were already waiting. Children ran beside the trucks waving scraps of cloth. Some torn from old flags, others from simple shirts. They weren't cheering because they had survived. They were cheering because they had overcome. For the first time, the desert road that once represented death had become a corridor of sovereignty. In Bamako, analysts watched the drone footage and whispered, "How?" Western media used words like unprecedented coordination and unknown command structure, as if discipline itself was foreign to Africa. But those on the ground didn't need analysis. They had lived through the turning point, the moment the hunted became the hunters. That night, inside a temporary command post, one radio crackled with a calm voice. A commander said simply, "This time, young boy, no one runs." His tone wasn't pride. It was clarity, the kind that comes when fear is replaced by purpose. News of Sikasso spread like fire through the region. It was more than a victory, it was a revelation. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, radios once filled with static began carrying coordinated codes. Soldiers who once fought separately now moved as if sharing one language, the language of sovereignty. In markets and villages, people began to speak differently. The words "Africa can" returned to conversation. Even old men, who had spent their lives watching promises break, began to smile when they heard the convoy story. But victory always carries shadows. In the wreckage of the ambush site, soldiers found fragments of communication gear marked with Western serial numbers, NATO-linked encryption codes. It was the kind of evidence that doesn't make the evening news, but explains everything. For the troops, it was confirmation of a truth long whispered. The war haunting the Sahel was never purely African. It was imported, financed, sustained. When those fragments reached Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré gathered his commanders. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "We do not measure progress by comfort. We measure it by control." Those words spread faster than any propaganda, repeated on every outpost radio, carved into the minds of men who now understood what they were fighting for. In the following days, while the world argued about alliances and Russian airlifts, the people on the ground began to understand something deeper. The fight wasn't just for territory, it was for identity. And as one soldier said quietly to a journalist who visited the front line, "We no longer wait for the world to rescue us. The world will now wait to understand us." By the time the convoy returned home, there were no parades, no medals, no speeches. Only silence. The kind that doesn't ask for applause, because it already knows its worth. But strength, once noticed, attracts pressure. And while the Sahel celebrated its newfound unity, the old order was already moving to strike back. Through sanctions, propaganda, and whispers meant to divide what had just begun to unite. In the weeks after Sikasso, the battlefields grew quiet. But the silence wasn't empty. Across the Sahel, that silence began to fill with new sounds. Markets reopening, hammers striking wood, children laughing again in schools that had stood abandoned for years. It was subtle, almost fragile, yet undeniable. Something in the rhythm of daily life had changed. In the villages around Jerry Forest, farmers returned to their fields, walking the same paths that once echoed with gunfire. You could still see the scars, burned huts, broken wells, but between them, green shoots were rising. For the first time in decades, people were planting without fear. "We don't look over our shoulders anymore," one farmer said quietly. "The sky is still hot, the land still hard, but the silence is no longer heavy, it's peaceful." At the same time, in the capitals of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, something equally historic was unfolding. Not through grand ceremonies or televised speeches, but through whispers, meetings, and decisions made in dimly lit rooms. Three nations that had spent decades under separate flags began to move as one. Officials didn't call it an alliance at first. They simply started coordinating. One supply chain here, one patrol there. A convoy escorted across borders without paperwork or permission. And then, without fanfare, the name appeared. AES, the Alliance of Sahel States. No anthems, no signatures on marble tables. Just action. Quiet, disciplined, and real. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Security through self-reliance. Each country would defend its land, support its neighbor, and stand apart from the organizations that once dictated their policies. No more waiting for ECOWAS resolutions. No more dependency on international missions that never left. To the outside world, it looked like rebellion. But to those living through it, it felt like rebirth. In Ouagadougou, a retired teacher named Alassane put it plainly. "We used to hear about freedom on the radio. Now we see it walking down our street in uniform." He wasn't celebrating war. He was celebrating ownership. The idea that the safety of one's home no longer depended on the will of others. Yet sovereignty has its price. Sanctions soon followed. Trade slowed. Foreign contracts vanished overnight. Western commentators called it isolationism. But inside the Sahel, the word people used was independence. Traoré and his partners knew this would happen. In his address to his generals, he said, "The road to dignity is built from stones, not comfort." That line spread through markets and schools like a proverb. Children began writing it on their notebooks. Street vendors quoted it to customers. It became the pulse of a new national confidence, the kind that cannot be bought or borrowed. Still, daily life wasn't easy. Fuel prices rose. Supply chains were thin. But the mood was different. Instead of despair, there was resilience. Radio stations that once played endless political commentary now filled the air with songs of unity. "The storm has only just begun," people said, not in fear but in faith. In Bamako and Niamey, leaders echoed the same sentiment. That sovereignty wasn't an event, but a process. They began investing in regional training, agricultural cooperatives, and local manufacturing. Small steps, yet monumental in their meaning. The goal wasn't luxury. It was longevity. Meanwhile, in Paris and Washington, think tanks held closed-door meetings trying to decode what had happened. Their reports used cautious language, emerging networks, potential Russian influence, unverified military cooperation. But they missed the essence. What was forming wasn't a foreign alliance. It was an African awakening. The streets told a different story. In Wahiguya, a street vendor summed it up perfectly. "Before we were poor and afraid. Now we are still poor, but not afraid." That single sentence captured what decades of diplomacy had failed to understand. Freedom doesn't always look like prosperity. Sometimes it looks like courage, and courage, once discovered, becomes contagious. Across the Sahel, murals began appearing on walls. Paintings of farmers beside soldiers, of children beside flags, of hands planting seeds in dry soil. No slogans, no propaganda, just one word beneath them all. Dignity. This was the quiet revolution, built not from coups or speeches, but from coordination, precision, and silence. The kind of silence that unsettles the powerful because it cannot be bought or predicted. As one journalist wrote anonymously, "The Sahel is no longer waiting for peace to be delivered. It is manufacturing it." But every revolution has its reckoning. The question now wasn't whether Africa could stand, but how long it could stand before the world tried to push it back down. In the months following the formation of the AES, the world's response came not with applause, but with unease. Across Western capitals, the silence that once surrounded the Sahel turned into a murmur, a mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and quiet fear. Reports crossed desks in Paris, London, and Washington with phrases underlined in red ink. Unprecedented synchronization, unknown command hierarchy, non-aligned military autonomy. The same think tanks that once described Burkina Faso as unstable were now calling it unpredictable. The tone had shifted, because unpredictability in their language meant control no longer belonged to them. In the White House Situation Room, Africa was once again on the screen. But this time it wasn't famine, crisis, or coups. It was coordination. The images confused policymakers. Convoys moving in perfect rhythm. Soldiers advancing with discipline, not desperation. Villagers rebuilding markets without foreign aid. The question hanging in the air wasn't how this was happening. It was why now. One analyst, an old veteran of Cold War policy, put it bluntly. "For the first time in my career, Africa is moving faster than our narrative." Around the table, no one disagreed. Media networks scrambled for explanations. Some claimed Russian involvement. Others hinted at Chinese logistics. Few dared to suggest the simplest truth, that Africans had learned to act on their own. Because to admit that would mean rewriting decades of assumptions, billions in foreign programs, and generations of dependency that had quietly served as leverage. Meanwhile, in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, the narrative was already rewritten. Markets were alive again. Children painted the letters AES on walls in chalk, not as propaganda, but as pride. The local radio announcer in Ouagadougou said it best. They wanted to study our rebellion. They didn't see it was never rebellion. It was return. And yet, far from the Sahel, Another kind of reflection began, one that stretched across oceans. In small towns in America, where veterans still keep old flags folded in wooden boxes, some began to recognize something familiar in these distant events: independence, self-determination, the courage to stand without permission, the same words their grandfathers once fought for. In Washington, a younger staffer at a foreign policy briefing made an uncomfortable comparison. If Africa is now doing what we once did in 1776, what does that make us? The room fell silent, not because the question was impolite, but because it was true. For 2 centuries, the United States had built its identity around the export of freedom. But in the Sahel, freedom had returned the favor. A new generation of Africans was doing what early Americans once did, fighting not for dominance, but for dignity. Still, not everyone saw it that way. Some Western media called it instability, others defiance. But the people who lived it had another word: rebirth. Because sovereignty once learned cannot be unlearned, and the nations that rediscover it will not bow again easily. President Ibrahim Traoré spoke quietly during a closed meeting with his generals. We are not fighting the West. We are fighting the weight of being underestimated. Those words spread quickly, translated into French, English, Hausa, Bambara, shared in markets, mosques, and mess halls. In a world obsessed with narratives, they became truth spoken without permission. Back in Europe, political editors debated whether this was the rise of African nationalism. In reality, it was something deeper, the rise of self-respect. It wasn't about rejecting the world, but about reminding it that Africa was never property to be managed. And so, while sanctions multiplied, and headlines warned of new isolation, the people of the Sahel kept working, repairing trucks, replanting fields, patrolling roads under the same sun that once burned their ancestors. For them, the debate was over. Freedom was no longer a gift to receive. It was a discipline to maintain. By the end of that year, one headline in an American newspaper summed it up in quiet resignation: Africa has stopped asking. It wasn't meant as praise, but in Ouagadougou, it was read as prophecy. Because the moment a people stop asking, they start deciding. And that decision, like every act of true freedom, cannot be undone. But every decision carries a cost, and as the world adjusts to a continent rewriting its role, one question remains: will the champions of freedom honor its return, or try, once again, to erase it? Night returns to the Sahel with the softness of a closing hymn. The desert cools, the wind settles, and the lights of small villages flicker like prayers across the horizon. After months of struggle, there are no parades, no speeches, no grand declarations. Only the quiet hum of engines returning home and the steady breath of a land rediscovering its strength. But silence here no longer means submission. It means focus. And in that focus, Africa is learning what the world forgot: that true power is not in the noise of victory, but in the patience to rebuild. Across the streets of Ouagadougou, children sketch new flags in the sand. 3 stars for 3 nations. A soldier kneels beside them, cleaning his rifle not out of fear but out of duty. The two share a look that needs no words. One represents the struggle, the other the future. Between them lies the hope that this time history will not repeat itself. Western newsrooms continue to debate what is happening here. They call it unrest, defiance, nationalism. But those who walk the dust roads of the Sahel know better. They call it rebirth. They have stopped waiting for validation from the same voices that once defined their destiny. Because you cannot liberate a people who have already stood up. Still, every sunrise brings new tests. Sanctions press harder. Supply lines thin. And the machinery of power shifts restlessly beyond the ocean. Yet the conviction remains: freedom is not measured by comfort. It is measured by control of one's land, one's choices, one's faith. In the churches and mosques of Burkina Faso, the prayers have changed. No longer save us, but strengthen us. Old hymns mix with new songs, sung in the languages of the Sahel, carried by the wind into a sky that has heard too many pleas and too few promises kept. Because the storm that began in Jerry Forest was never about destruction. It was about cleansing, clearing the dust of dependency so that new seeds could take root. And so, tonight, as we end this story, ask yourself, what happens when a continent once silenced begins to speak with one voice? When those long underestimated decide not to ask, but to act? The answer may not come from headlines, but from the quiet places. From a farmer returning to his field, from a teacher reopening her classroom, from a soldier watching over a road that now belongs to his people. If this story reached you, let it stay with you, because truth, like freedom, survives only when carried by those who believe in it. Share it, not for algorithms, but for memory. Speak it, not for noise, but for justice. And remember, you can delete a video, but you cannot erase a vision once it has taken root in the hearts of men. May this victory be humble but lasting. May every nation that rises do so with dignity, not pride. And may God bless the land where storms no longer destroy, they cleanse.